A little bit about me to begin with, if that's okay. I grew up in Stoke Newington, Clissold Road, the flats at the top, 7 Fallsby House to be precise. My family moved from Whitechapel, like many Jewish families did after the Second World War. Lots of Jewish families moved into Hackney and Stoke Newington. That's my Dutch family on the top left. That's my dad. He was a cabinet maker, and he worked in the Lee Valley in the 60s and 70s because Stoke Newington was not an island. People went to different places to work. And I'm going to talk a bit about where people went to work mostly in the 70s and the 80s. But I'm also going to be talking about what's changed. So 5 years ago, I started a project. I took lots of pictures in the 70s and 80s. And I started a project 5 years ago looking at how things had changed. And what interested me was, what did it mean for people? That's really what I'm interested in. My timing wasn't great because you might recall at the beginning of 2020 something happened. So that meant I lost 2 years effectively. Top right is me and my mum. That was Rosa's corset shop. Anyone remember Rosa's? Right, that was owned by my auntie. My mum worked there till she retired. On the bottom left, just to give some idea of where my dad came from, that's where he was brought up in Whitechapel. I mean, it's literally a hovel. So what was it like in the 70s and 80s? So as a kid, certainly in the 60s when I was a kid, it was great because there were loads of empty houses everywhere. So you could just go and play in them. This is just a scene from different places in Hackney. This was actually quite close to here. That line doesn't exist. You can see they're all boarded up now. Boarded up houses everywhere. In 1981, it was estimated there were around 2,300 empty properties in Hackney. One of the things that had been happening was depopulation. Hackney, the numbers in Hackney as a whole, I know it's not Stoke Newington, but I haven't got the figures for Stoke Newington. Apologies, Emma. So in 1911, the population of Hackney was 385,000. By 1981, it was 180,000. That was the lowest point. It's now around 260,000. But one of the things about the empty properties is it meant there were squatters moving in. There were places that were called hard to let, and you had what I call the post-68 generation moving in. These were basically political activists. A lot of the pictures I took were for different community newspapers. Now I realise there might be some young people here. So before the internet, there were things like this called newspapers, okay? Some of them, I mean, there were a lot in Hackney and Stoke Newington. I mean, amazingly, really. Usually because people couldn't agree, so they'd start their own one. And the Stoke Newington People's Paper, the top left, that's pretty rare because they decided to say that one councillor was the best councillor money could buy, and libel then was pretty much the same as it is now. So there were 2 issues. And the thing about the slum clearance, they were building new homes. But some of them were pretty appalling. This was the Smalley Road estate, where you can see the kinds of conditions. And a lot of the community newspapers were actually campaigning around changing those kinds of places, trying to improve them. And actually, if you look at what's happening recently, there are still estates being built that are very, very damp. So where did people work? Well, I'm going to talk about 2 of the biggest factories in Hackney. One was Lesney's, which was over by Homerton, which at its height employed about 1,600 people, mostly women, and they came from all over Hackney, including Stoke Newington. How did they get there? Lesney's were very smart. They bought a fleet of ex-London Transport double-decker buses. And what they did was they arranged a shift system around women being able to take their kids to school and pick them up. So you'd see the buses going all over the borough, picking women, mostly women. And I took pictures there in 1981, which was the year before it closed. And there was an amazing sense of community there, because they'd worked there for a long time, a lot of them. They knew each other. And the reason it closed there's two big reasons. One was patterns of toys were changing, what children were doing. But the most significant reason was containerisation, because quite a few miles away, the London docks had been closing, and containerisation was coming into Tilbury. So when Lesnies closed, all of the machinery was shipped to Hong Kong, and it was made in Hong Kong and shipped around the world in containers. And although we didn't use the phrase at the time, it was actually the beginning of globalisation as we now know it. The toys are still made. They're actually now made in Thailand by, remember the name of the company? Mattel, one of the biggest companies in the world. And there is a kind of pattern which we'll probably see as we go through about some of the changes. So what's there now is called Matchmaker's Wharf. That's actually, the freehold is owned, I have to get this right, by William Waldorf Astor IV. He owns the freeholds of more than 160,000 properties throughout the UK. And one of the things I think about this is that Lesnies was a British-owned company. Most of the people there lived in the area. So the taxes and the income basically stayed in the area. The freehold for that goes to an incredibly wealthy, the lease payments go to an incredibly wealthy man. One of the things that happened in 2018 was Grenfell. These had the same panels as Grenfell. So for 7 years, they had fire wardens going around the place. They're still waiting for complete remediation. The other really, really important place was Simpsons on the High Street. People know Simpsons? You probably know there's a place called Beyond Retro in one bit of the building. At the back of the building, there's lots of apartments. So again, I took pictures there, again in about 1981. They made clothes for a company called Dax. And then when they opened, it was being built in 1929. It was the most advanced tailoring factory in the world. And Dax was very successful because they made self-supporting trousers for men. So you didn't need a belt and braces. It had an elasticated band around it. At its height, they were producing 6,000 pairs of trousers a week. And it was very highly skilled work. But what happened when it changed, the whole tailoring garment industry changed in the UK. I mean, in 1981, 12,000 people in Hackney were working in tailoring. And one of the things which sometimes people think about in the 1980s is that when the recession happened, manufacturing kind of collapsed. Often that's associated with, say, the Northwest or Northeast, whatever. London lost more manufacturing jobs than anywhere else in the country. So what happened when the tailoring industry changed was lots of small companies started, particularly Turkish companies, and what they were trying to do was turn around stuff really, really quickly for the high street, as cheaply as possible. And this is in Simpsons. And obviously when you've got your clothes, you've got some added ash with it as well. Now I took a picture in Beyond Retro, and there are a couple of things that interested me about this. One, this is Matthew. Now in the 80s, he couldn't walk down the high street like that. Because one of the other things I'm interested in, what are the changes in attitudes and behaviours? And I think one of the things that comes up repeatedly in the pictures I've taken, and this is only a tiny, tiny sample of the pictures I've taken over the years, is those kinds of really quite profound changes that were almost unthinkable in the 70s and 80s. So Beyond Retro is owned 50% by a Canadian company, 50% by a Swedish company. And they do what's called transfer pricing. So guess where the money goes? Any thoughts? Canada and Sweden. And now they employ hardly anybody there. At the back of the building are apartments. The apartments are owned by a Turkish billionaire who lives in Monaco. So again, the money is going straight out. And you know, people have talked about a 15-minute city. One of the things that was quite interesting, I think, when I looked into this, I thought actually, in those periods of 70s and 80s and earlier, it was actually a 15-minute city because people could walk to work, they'd walk to the local shops, and it was 15 minutes, give or take. How's this one? Ridley Road Market. That's 1981. Heaving with people. My mum would go down there with a shopping trolley, as indeed you can see many others did. And now, kind of not quite so much, kind of declining as the demography changes. So there was, I'm interested also in what's changed in places. So this synagogue was in Amos Park. It was North London Progressive Synagogue. And I was taking pictures for a book about Jewish life in Britain. And I went back to see what had changed. And by then, it'd been taken over by people, guardians of the property, who turned it into a party place. And of course, one of the reasons they're there is because it was the cheapest place that they could find to live. It's now being turned back in, I believe, into a school for Orthodox Jewish children. So the gig economy, how long has the gig economy been around for? Any thoughts? Quite a long time. This is Mrs. Fulano. She actually lived in Albion Road. That wasn't her real name. And she was making clothes, and each day a van would come along, give her the clothes to make. It was piecework. So the more she made, the more she got paid. And I worked out, if you adjusted for inflation, she was getting about £3 an hour. And now we have delivery riders. This is Anna. She's from Brazil. She came here because she wanted to try and save up enough money to go to medical school, and she couldn't do that in Brazil. The day I took pictures, she was getting about £2.90 an hour equivalent and working about 10 hours a day. So you have to ask what kind of changes are taking place. And of course, the other big difference is her work is probably scheduled by an algorithm that's been developed in San Francisco. Always been lots of protests in Hackney, lots and lots. I've got loads of stuff that were taken in Hackney Town Hall in the 80s, which were quite something. So this was Hackney Fair's fight, which was when Ken Livingstone was leader of the Greater London Council, and he reduced the fares across the whole of London, which meant more people used buses and tubes. What a surprise. What happened, though, was Bromley Council, which was Conservative controlled, objected because they didn't have any tube lines in Bromley, and so he lost the case, and the government ruled against them. So this is Dalston, and this is pretty much the same place, with the delivery riders protesting about where they can park their bikes. So the 80s was really a decade of turmoil. Thatcher came in 1971, and in 1981 there were riots all over Britain, including Stoke Newington. This was along the High Street, and you can see the policeman here actually having quite a nice time, enjoying it. But it really was a night of, well, more than one night, of looting and violence. And the police were driving up and down Kingston High Street, and they would jump out and basically charge people, whoever happened to be there. I took this from the top of the Rio Cinema. So it's quite blurry. And then stupidly, I then took a picture using a flash gun, and one of the cops kind of looked up, and I thought, oh, I better get out of here fast, and I did. But there's also a period of time when there was a lot of harassment of the black community. Stoke Newington police station was notorious. This was around the case of Newton Rose. He was convicted of murder. There was a big, big campaign. He was released on appeal, right, because they said he'd been framed by the police, and that was won in the court of appeal. Go back, sorry. The other big case was Colin Roach. He was found dead with gunshot wounds in Stoke Newington police station. There was a huge campaign for a public inquiry into how that took place, but there was never a public inquiry, ever. But I was also interested in what's happening in schools and how that changed. So this is Clissold Park School, now known as Stoke Newington, and you've got two lads doing very laddish things. So I went back there and also did some portraits of students to get some sense of what's changing. And so what I'm trying to do is to see if visually you can see what's happening, right, on lots of different levels. So this is Dinaver Road, back of William Patton. Now, bizarrely, I went to William Patton School, okay. This was 1974. What do you notice about it? Any thoughts? Can you see any parents? No. Not a single parent in sight. All the children come to school on their own and actually holding each other's hands. Same road. Not one child without a parent. And also playtime. Again, this is 1974, these pictures. Girls playing hula hoop, wearing skirts. William Patton School, girls playing football, wearing trousers. Now, Hackney was really poor in the 80s. It was kind of known as one of the poorest places in Britain. This was a homeless family in bed and breakfast accommodation. At that point in time, there were about 200 families in bed and breakfast accommodation. And I was involved in a campaign to get the council to stop using it because it was dangerous, it wasn't safe, it was appalling for the children. There's now more than 3,000 families in homeless accommodation from Hackney. But the other thing about the 80s, there were no food banks. So this is the food bank in Church Street. So what you've had is this huge increase in inequalities and poverty. So the other thing I've been doing is I like, interviewing people, meeting people, getting their stories. And I was particularly interested in the mosque in Shacklewell Lane. You know the mosque? Yeah. It used to be a synagogue. And actually there are still some signs within the building, which I've got pictures of the synagogue. And this is Erkin, who is the spiritual leader of the mosque. He's not he's a spiritual leader. And what he told me, which was kind of interesting, just find it, make sure I got it right, is that he was also framed by Stoke Newington police. Spent 6 years in prison before being released on appeal. Let's go back. Anybody know Rabbi Gluck? Yes. Okay. So I've been doing some work with Rabbi Gluck, and I noticed on the wall he had a very large version of this picture, and I asked him about it. So he holds the last 9 photograph of his grandparents. They'd been expelled from their homes in Austria in 1938 and taken to a ghetto in Vienna. Their homes and possessions were seized by the Nazis. His mother and her siblings were able to escape Nazi rule on the Kindertransport. And I think the thing that's important to remember is to be on the Kindertransport, you had to have a sponsor. It wasn't a government thing, it was a private sponsor thing. By the time his grandparents had found a sponsor, the doors of Europe had closed. Rabbi Gluck said, when they realized there was no way out for them to Britain, they dressed themselves on a weekday in their best Shabbos clothes and went to a photographic studio in Vienna. They sent that photo to their children. On the back, written with blood, with tears and with love, it says, "We are sending you this photo and we hope that you remember us and consider that we are always with you." The whole family were taken to Poland and used as slave labour until 1944, when they were murdered together with over 100 members of their family. So obviously there's a huge Hasidic community in Stamford Hill, and this picture I took again in 1981. It had to be in 1981. It was a festival called Birkit HaKarma, and it's a Jewish blessing that only takes place once every 28 years, when it's believed that the sun appears in the same place as when the earth was first created. So this was in a playground in Stamford Hill. And for those of you who are keen to take the picture next time, it's 2037. And so one of the many differences that have taken place, so this was Purim then, which was a fairly modest affair that took place in people's homes. The community wasn't as big as it is now. It's quite hard to get accurate estimates of quite how big the community is. But now Purim is quite a big deal. And I'm sure many of you would have seen what goes on Purim. And to say it's pretty colourful would be an understatement. So this is taken from what used to be Centerprise at the top of the building, about 1981. You can see the NatWest Tower, and so obviously Big Bang when was Big Bang? 1986, I think. The explosion of what happened in the city, you've got not just the tower blocks, but basically it pushed everything north, mostly. So, and it did things like put rents up, put house prices up, completely changed the character of the whole borough. There's no question about that. But we're about to finish, because I think I'm doing fine on time. So this was one of the first pictures I ever took. 1971, I was still at school. I really didn't know very much about the world or life. Okay, I was pretty naive. This was Abney Park Chapel, completely collapsed, right? And I took the picture because I liked the framing, okay? And at the time, there were quite a lot of men wandering around the cemetery. And I thought they were looking for gravestones. I kid you not, okay? So I was really pleased to be able to go and take a photo of the first gay wedding that ever took place at Abney Park Cemetery. And I'm finishing now. 2 little books are on sale if you want them. If you follow me on Instagram, I occasionally put stuff up, but I also kind of do stuff about talks and things I'm doing. Most of the work I do will not appear in social media, because I don't particularly like it, but I do lots of different talks. This is an extremely abbreviated talk, so if you want to come to another one that I do, which is a bit more expansive, but it's basically following those kinds of themes, and just trying to understand what do these changes actually mean for people? How does it change what we do and how we do it? So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully see you again.